are not here this morning merely to remember a story. We are here to participate in a story. We're not here because we just have this particular interest in something that happened a long time ago in a faraway place. We're here because we are convinced that the story of what happened 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem is still in a very real way happening. And because we believe that we can be part of this story. As I cast my mind's eye to that Palm Sunday story, the image that comes first and foremost to mind is of the crowds. Now, the crowds were extensive because probably hundreds of thousands of people would have been streaming into Jerusalem at the same time as Jesus and his followers. They would have been coming to Jerusalem, particularly at this time of year, for the celebration of the Passover, for this most holy celebration in this most holy place. And within those crowds of perhaps hundreds of thousands, a particular crowd of people gathers around Jesus. Now, Jesus very intentionally decides to ride into Jerusalem at the start of this week on that Sunday, riding on the colt of a donkey. And in so doing, he aligns himself with the inbreaking of God's kingdom of peace and justice. And this crowd gathers around him because they recognize something of God's power at work in Jesus. These crowds of people are desperate, hungry, disenfranchised, and they have been longing for God to act decisively and to send a Messiah who will save them. And we hear and see what they anticipate that Messiah looking like as they shout their hosannas and name Jesus as the new King David, the one who is going to return them to that golden era of political and religious independence. They want Jesus to free them from their Roman oppressors. As a sign of who they hope Jesus is, they lay their cloaks on the road in front of Jesus' path. And the Gospel of John, which we didn't hear from today, tells us that they wave palm branches. Those palm branches are symbols of victory and of communal joy. And they give us the name for today's celebration, Palm Sunday. Now, as my mind's eye goes to those crowds, I start to see particular faces and groups in that crowd. Because the reality is that the people who gather around Jesus on this day do so for a variety of reasons and with a number of different experiences that bring them there. I think of those who were probably closest to Jesus as he rode into Jerusalem, the male disciples of Jesus, the ones who tend to be front and center and get the most airtime. And I imagine how they must have just been buzzing with excitement on this particular Sunday. Because, of course, they have hoped all along that maybe Jesus is God's Messiah, the one that they have been hoping and longing for. And it's because of this hope that they gave up their homes and their families and their livelihoods in order to tether their lives to Jesus. And today on this Sunday, it looks like the big payoff. It looks like their hope is being realized as all of these other people see in Jesus the same thing that they have also seen in Jesus. And yet we know, as much as they love being close to Jesus in this moment, we know that by the end of the week, they'll mostly be gone. We know that as much as they desire to be close to Jesus, they find it very hard to stay close to Jesus. I see some other disciples in the crowd around Jesus on this Sunday, and they're the ones that don't get as much airtime because they're the women disciples, and they aren't seen as mattering as much. And maybe because of that, they seem a lot less invested in the political aspirations of who Jesus might be. They seem a lot more connected to Jesus, the person, a lot more attentive to actually listening to him and getting to know him and caring for him. And they seem in a really very real way to have already experienced how Jesus has seen them and heard them and empowered them, and because of that, how they have been healed and set free in a powerful way. I see in the crowd the Pharisees. They're also pretty front and center in this story, and we need to be reminded that they are not, in fact, bad guys. That they are just people who are trying to carve out some measure of stability and prosperity in the midst of a very volatile and difficult culture in which they live. They're also always trying to negotiate for their people to be able to continue to practice their faith even under Roman oppression. And in order for them to be able to do that, they have to make nice with Rome. They're very unsettled and fearful about what they see happening in this crowd today because it has the power to undo what little measure of stability and peace they have. And they also are longing for God's Messiah, but they don't see God's Messiah in Jesus because God is not acting in the way that they expect. I see in this crowd the Roman soldiers who would have been everywhere in Jerusalem at this time. And they are charged with an impossible task because it is their job to keep order at a time where people are hyped up with religious fervor and where expectations of an oppressed people are always threatening to boil over. In those groups of the Pharisees and the Roman soldiers, we know that there are at least a couple who are going to break ranks with the party line and who are not going to be able to stop themselves from naming the power of God at work in Jesus. I see in this crowd Mary, Jesus' mother. We don't explicitly hear in this scripture story that she was there, but we do know that it was her family's practice to go to Jerusalem for the time of Passover, and we know that by the end of the week, she is very firmly by Jesus' side. I see Mary, and I see her heart already breaking. She's always known right from the beginning, right from before the beginning, that Jesus was destined for difficult and great things. That Jesus' life was not just for her, but for everyone. And yet, this is still her little boy, bone of her bone and flesh of her flesh, And she is already experiencing the heartbreak of seeing one that she loves so much suffer and die. As I said, we're not just here to remember this story, we're here to be part of it. And so I ask you, what brings you into this story? What resonates and connects with you? What has led you to come out of your individual homes, whether you're in person, whether you're online, to carve out this time and space together in order to join your story to Jesus' story? I'm guessing that for many of us, we come to this worship celebration with prayers for peace. I think most of us, if not all of us, have been utterly horrified by the stories of violence and slaughter out of Ukraine, knowing that those stories of violence and slaughter are taking place in all too many locations of violence all across our world. And surely all of us in some measure can relate to the shouts of that crowd who are hoping and praying for the God of peace and justice to act in our world and act in our lives, and to bring an end to the violence and the warfare, and to usher in that reign of peace. Where else does your story connect to these many stories in the crowd? Do you know something of that desire to be faithful to Jesus and to stay close to him? Do you know something of how easy it is to drift away, to find yourself faithless in ways that surprise you? Do you have stories of grace and mercy and transformation, of how you have already, in some real way, experienced how the way of Jesus and the person of Jesus has healed you and set you free? Do you come this morning with the sense of being given some kind of impossible task? Do you have a heavy burden that you carry with you into worship this morning? Do you have blind spots? Do you have ways in which your vision is clouded to the presence and activity of God? Can you identify in your own life ways in which it's hard to see what God is actually doing, because God isn't doing what you expected God to be doing? Do you have those experiences of how you have been confronted by the surprise of God's grace and mercy acting in ways that you didn't expect? Do you come here this morning with stories of love? Stories of love and heartbreak? Do you know the cost of loving someone through pain, through loss, through death? Have you experienced the love of others holding and sheltering you in your times of greatest vulnerability and pain and hurt, even when it costs them dearly to do so? I want you to take a look at those palm crosses that you received on the way in this morning. Those palm crosses connect us to this Palm Sunday story and are part of how we enter and participate in this story. But those crosses also point to what is to come. Because we know that we're not here as followers of some great militaristic victor. We know that that's not what Jesus has to offer. He's not going to overthrow the Roman oppressors. He's not going to be the new King David in the way that people expected. And my guess is that if he had have done that, if he had have overthrown Rome, that might have been really impressive in the moment and maybe inconsequential in the long term. My guess is that we wouldn't be here today to join our lives to some great military leader. We're here today because of where Jesus ultimately leads us, to the heart of human suffering, darkness, realness, and honesty. Those palm crosses show us the shape that God's power is really going to take. Because 2,000 years ago and also right now, God is always at work gathering up all of these individual stories, all of our individual stories, not leaving any of us out. The disciples and the Pharisees and the soldiers and the parents, the ones who are faithful, the ones who are faithless, the ones who are betrayers, the ones who are dreamers, and all of the heartbroken. All of them are being gathered into this story. All of us are being gathered into this story. And ultimately, in gathering of all of us in, God promises to meet us. God promises to speak to our deepest and shared human desire. Because the truth is that all of us have been created for one common purpose, which is to know God's love and to be part of God's love. To be gathered into and to participate in a love and a life that is unbreakable, unstoppable, and everlasting. With our eyes open to how God's power is actually going to be shaped with each of our stories and all of our stories. Let the journey begin.